Tonight, I'm going to talk about kind of the very edge of development. It's kind of a conversation with design teams and how we can make performance very early on part of the process of creating a website, right? Because technically, development is just part of the thing, right? Like, no one cares about the internals of the technology. What we care about is what user experience would be, right? I mean, surely we love the technical challenge, but in reality, users don't care most of the time. So hopefully some of you already know that speed matters. It's kind of crazy, but people care about performance. They will not say that. They will not really parade like speed matters, only I do, right? But not only I do, but quite a few technical people parade it. But generally, people don't understand it, but they care a lot. And they care enough to leave your site if it's slow. And this is one of the very early charts, actually, one of the very early RUM, real user measurement pieces of data that shows that the blue lines are kind of performance, how many people were in the bucket for this performance, right? So for example, the biggest amount of users were between 2 and 3 seconds for this website. And this was Walmart Labs data, you know. And there's like obviously long tails, by the way. So if someone tells you their website is 4 seconds fast or 4 seconds slow, don't trust them because there's always a distribution. Just remember that. But what's important is that the red line is actually conversion rate, right? You can see that there is a pretty big difference between conversion in the very early stage, like buckets, and conversion all the way up there. So if you optimize from 20 seconds to 15 seconds, you might do a little bit of a difference. But if you can optimize that to 1 to 2 seconds, the difference can be 10 times revenue, right? Like, imagine that, right? So performance actually is a very business-centric thing. It's no longer technological kind of let's save some money by doing better technology thing, right? It's a first attempt, it's a first opportunity for us to convert technical debt in actual revenue. In the past, it was always about quality, kind of theoretical improvement of how we can make it better. Maybe availability was obviously a thing, right? But this is a perfect case where we can make our code, make our application better from very technical side, right? Not business, not design, not features, right? And still make a lot of money. So these are stats from WPO Stats. I kind of mentioned them a little bit. So hopefully this can equip you with some talking points, or at least a perspective, when you go and ask for budgets. Because budgets are critical. You cannot just, after small, simple optimizations, you cannot just come and say, hey, I want to do this performance optimization thing. And it will take me a couple years, many years to do that, right? No one will say, yeah, of course. They have some features to ship. And some of these numbers will help you sell that. As I mentioned, yeah, it was Trainline. $11.5 million per year, and they just optimized 300 milliseconds out of their page load. 11.5 million. Imagine what you can do if you are much farther on that thing, the long tail, right? And WPO Stats collected awesome pieces of data, right? When we started, we were hunting for those first two, three. It was like the mecca for us, and luckily the Tommy and Tim started to document this. It's kind of somewhat e-commerce heavy, obviously, but there are some use cases from media business and things like that. So highly recommend that. So for example, latest DoubleClick study is pretty important, right? Doubling revenue on mobile. Anyone up to that? No? Okay. So there is another side of performance kind of money question. It's slowness. Tim Kadlik, again, same guy. He created what does my site cost? You enter your URL, it runs a web page test, analyzes that, and calculates based, like this particular chart is kind of percentage of your daily budget, right? So in some of those countries, I forgot, so this is Disney.com. In Mauritania, it's 2.73% of the person's daily budget on average. So what is it? 40 pages? and you don't have anything to eat, don't have anywhere to sleep, you run out of budget. In fact, today was an interesting thing. I think CNET had a page that was 130 megabytes in size. It was $16 in Canada per page load in terms of data. And by the way, this is mobile cost, right? Cost of mobile traffic. And many of the developing countries actually only use it for mobile, right? So hopefully CNET will fix that. I doubt that was intentional. But yeah, and kind of 130 megabyte is kind of an extreme, even by today's standards, right? But still, it's doable. Your content creators, your product people, they can put gigabytes into that if they want to, right? Especially like 3D models, things like that. I can imagine you guys probably heard that a lot, right? So this is, especially if you're targeting developing countries or you're targeting heavy mobile traffic heavy areas. For example, Canada is pretty high on this list usually because it's mobile is very costly there, right? So just keep that in mind. Again, what does my site cost.com? So for that reason, I kind of started to work, a few years back, I started to work on figuring out where do our fundamental problems come from. And obviously, as every web development, it comes from a product decisions and design, then development, then releasing it, and then operations, optimization, things like that. But it starts from product and design. And that's what I think is missing here, because today we kind of don't think of performance during design phase. And hopefully when you leave this event, you will go back to work, and next time you see a designer, you tell them, speed matters, right? And why was that a problem all these years, right? Kent Alstad talked about it on Velocity last year, actually, saying that oil paintings that our designers create today, like Photoshop files, don't really reflect the user experience on the web page when it loads. It's much closer to a short film, right? And instead of being painters, you need to become movie director, right? Short clip, short movie director. And many designers have a challenge with that, obviously. They kind of got used to that. They probably came from paper world and things like that. Even in current digital world, we deliver Photoshop mockups, right? Which definitely are not movie clips, right? They're our digital oil paintings today. And I believe it's like fifth time I mentioned Tim's name. Sorry. He was actually presenting here at New York Web Perf Days in 2004, and he gave a talk called Performance Choreography. And he talked about how animation and user interaction on web pages kind of needs that touch of the director, right? He drove analogies with Disney and how animation is actually complicated art and science, where you need to plan every interaction, every short transition when like a character runs away from the screen. Like every millisecond counts, every stage there counts, and otherwise it's not believable, right? And he talked about our current medium of design delivery not really delivering that piece of knowledge and that piece of experience, right? So in reality, when we apply this to web pages, what it means is that our page cannot just show up, right? Because it will probably show up late. What it can do is incrementally, progressively render and show to the user the most important things first, and then kind of enhance itself to being full page, right? We had these discussions like in the past 3-4 years when we talk about responsive design, right? In terms of like different devices and support, progressive enhancement to support different features on different devices. This talk is primarily about the other side of it. It's about speed and progressively downloading and constructing the page in front of the user, right? So when we talk about progressive enhancement, as a particular way of building things, it's most known for enhancing for browser capabilities, right? Like touch events, loading JavaScript when it's necessary, image formats and stuff like that, or compass support and location-based services, right? Like when we probably will talk partially at the next meetup when we talk about progressive web apps about it as well. But this new meaning that I tried to incorporate is about progress of user experience, right? So on the first topic, I have nothing to say except for a lot of opinions. So you might want to check out an awesome book by Filament Group, who you probably heard of, especially if you care about performance. They developed a lot of things in image, responsive images cases, right? They developed a few technologies there, and they talk about it a lot. They provide open source tools, and now there is a book called Designing with Progressive Enhancement. Funny enough, right? But it primarily talks about responsive side of it, right? It primarily talks about accommodating all the devices that we have online, right? And I'm going to kind of concentrate primarily on revealing features progressively, right? How that can help, and as you saw, the time chart with a losing conversion, right? We want to deliver a meaningful experience as early as possible to capture those users. So if we look at the overall process of page load, right? We can group that into different stages. And obviously different pages are different, and the commerce is different from media and things like that. So I try to kind of create as agnostic categorization as possible of these rendering stages of the web page. And there are approximately 5 core stages, plus number 6 or number 0, depending on how you look at it. I want to go through one by one through that experience of page load and talk about what we might want to do to deliver the most important pieces as quickly as possible and kind of prioritize that. Right? So the first phase is, I call it verified destination. Maybe it's not the perfect name there, but the whole idea behind it is the user, first thing they need to know is that if they're landing where they wanted to land, they typed in whatever they want in Google, like client bottle opener, and they want to see that page that they expect to see, right? It's the most important piece, because if they don't see what they wanted to see, they click back, or if by that time Google results are still there, they click the second link, meaning your closest competitor, right? So we want to verify that they're landing where they're supposed to land as quickly as possible. And good examples are like core branding, like colors of the brand, logo usually, right? You want to make sure, like, if your brand is recognizable among your potential clients, then you might want to have a logo there, the name there, so they know from when they came from Google, they land where they were supposed to land. Sometimes it's about coming from external site, but also going from page to page on your site. Other good examples are kind of section headings or breadcrumbs. Like in this case on Amazon, it's a breadcrumb. Like you looked for printer, it shows you, hey, we are about to show you search results for printer, right? So you're like, oh, okay, let me wait a little bit, right? Your brain thinks about it. Or like for True TV, when you were going to watch a full episode, you kind of want to know that you're landing on the full episode page, and it's kind of okay to wait for the full experience to load if you're about to spend an hour watching a full episode. So the second stage is kind of the most important one. It's probably why user came, and it's definitely why you want them to be on this page. It's called primary content. And there's always a challenge here, right? The challenge is that everyone wants to be a primary content. You have many stakeholders in the business. They all want their stuff to be primary. But sometimes it's kind of easy, because each page has a clear owner, and they actually have a good voice and say, hey, this is a primary. So, like, this is CNN homepage. If you ask anyone on the editorial team at CNN, they will tell you that this area with 2 photos and that headline are the primary thing, right? The designers designed for it. Editors spend hours creating this kind of headline to make sure it's awesome, right? To capture as much interest as possible. So why is it important to be this early in the process? And if you remember, there is this green line that kind of shows you the experience, right? We want these stages to appear in that sequence, right? Because users cannot consume next phase until they kind of interacted with the previous one. And the sooner we show it, the better. And we don't want to delay previous phases. So obviously, primary content is why they came for, right? They're okay to wait a little bit seeing your branding, but if they don't see that bottle opener in its glory on the page and opening the bottle, they don't really understand if they want to buy it or whatever your primary action there is. So identifying this primary content and prioritizing it, loading it as quickly as possible is important. And after they consumed the primary content or started to consume the primary content, you kind of want them to buy, right? Or whatever they need to do on that page, whatever your intent on that page was. Kind of act on that primary content. That's why they call call to actions. Those buttons are usually called call to action. We ask them, hey, please go ahead and do this. Like for Amazon page, primary call to action is clearly the buy button, right? There are a few secondary ones, right? Like browsing the other images or maybe scrolling down, reading some content, but the primary one is clearly the buy button. At least for most commerce places, that's the case. It's a little different for other businesses, but when designer designs this page, they really know what the primary call to action is, which is great. And it's kind of obvious that until they know what they want to act upon, they would not click on that button, right? So if they didn't see primary content, like here, right, they will not really do the call to action thing, right? So the sequence is kind of obvious. Like show them the primary content, help them understand if they came to the right thing, maybe read it. Maybe some of them are very impulse buyers and they're just like, oh, image looks good, title seems okay, price is okay, buy, right? Some of them will be a little deeper, but you kind of want that sequence to preserve. Primary content, then purchase or whatever. Again, I keep giving examples from the e-commerce world, but that's not necessarily the only way to address that. And then the next phase might be actually the hardest one. Because once you identify the primary content, the obvious thing is clear. So what is the secondary content? What is like a second most important piece, right? Because you want it happening pretty quickly, because if user didn't want to perform primary action, you want them to perform a secondary action or consume secondary content, but you don't want to say, hey, when everything loads, they can consume the rest, right? So identifying these other examples of secondary content is quite critical. And sidebars is a good example as a secondary navigation, right? I'm positive CNN sidebar management is pretty crazy on this page, right? People spend hours and hours, and a lot of important decision making going on. Navigation I mentioned. The secondary content, like maybe that image over there being like a second grade story or whatever, maybe not as hot, but sitting there longer or whatever. UGC, social buttons, if they read the content, read the story, or liked your picture on Pinterest, like that crazy snail, Halloween snail, right? You want them to share on Facebook and on Twitter and all. Yes? So the question is, how do we deal with jankiness? If your secondary content takes time to load and kind of not loading in a very smooth way, right? That's what the term jank is, by the way, very official term. Is that considered bad experience? Absolutely, yes. It is considered bad experience. I doubt it is designed that way, though, right? So this is kind of a purely technical solution. We want to make sure it's not janky, right? But it's actually a valid point. If designers don't point out that this needs to show up quickly, and the most important secondary action is to scroll quickly, right? For example, like to the comments or whatever, and it's not performing well, then it needs to be called out. That's a good point, right? So sometimes it's not about the zones alone, right? It's about the feeling of experience and things like that. Ads are kind of one other important secondary content piece. If you talk to sales team, they might say it's a primary content, but if you have a problem with like talking to them, you might want to hire on your team, hire the editorial person, not hire, but bring them over and say, hey, you know that the salespeople tell me that their ads are more important than your stories, and you have a great ally, and they will fight for clear identification of what's primary, what's secondary, right? That's the only way to fight those wars, because usually salespeople bring your salary, right? Very hard argument to win, especially in media business, right? Where it's the only way to make money. Right? And then there is kind of the rest, right? Load the rest of the stuff, we don't really care. It's there for unknown reasons. Somehow someone wanted that, we designed that, and let's load it anyway. Sometimes that's how we talk about ads and background ads and things like that. But it also applies not only to those things, but to this secondary experience, that the below the fold experience, right? And that's where invisible tasks kind of category comes in, where it's things like slides on the carousel, right? That's my favorite topic. If anyone attended Meet for Speeds, I'm very passionate about my carousels. The carousel is not a carousel until it starts rotating. Until then, it's just an image, right? So second image in a carousel doesn't show, and it's not a primary content, right? It's definitely not the secondary content, because no one can see it until time passes, right? Some arguments ensue usually about carousels, but anyway. But it's clearly an invisible piece, right? Below the fold is another great example. Many of you probably use the lazy loading technique, right? Images that are below the fold are not loaded, so the rest of the assets that are visible can be loaded as quickly as possible, and then maybe on scroll or maybe just delayed, you load the rest of the images, right? Depending on your business use case, it can be different. Like search results page on an e-commerce site is usually like very long with many images, maybe swatches, like product, separate, like multicolor thingies or whatever that is, right? It's a lot of assets. You probably already employ lazy loading. And great, you are already doing that. That's the first example of designers actually thinking about it. They probably heard the word though, and they're like, oh, can you just paint some lazy loading on top of it? Like have a bucket of lazy loading, just pour it over the code, and it will work, right? But it's a first attempt, right? Like that's what they already did. So you kind of want to drive that conversation and keep, maybe that's your anchor. When they say that, you're like, oh yeah, like we want to prioritize our loading. Let's do more about it, right? And another aspect that is very important to the business is tracking and analytic beacons and some other maybe third-party calls that, for whatever reason, need to happen. Good news is that users don't give a shit whatsoever. They don't see it. They don't do anything about it. You care. So make sure that analytics thing does not degrade the user experience. Because if you're measuring business effect and degrading that business at the same time, you're kind of not measuring it right. And it's probably every day's case. Yes? Yes, so the question is there a standard definition for below the fold? No, there is none. No. Exactly for that reason, that there are many devices, right? And unfortunately, the term itself came from newspaper, right? So like it's about the newspaper being folded, and it lays on the other secondary content down, and the primary is up, right? Great term, right? It's very easy to draw this line and have this like Photoshop mock-up that kind of was created, right? It's a Photoshop mock-up on which resolution? I have no clue. You probably had the discussion with the designer, like, what is the real pixel size here, right? Like, and the reality is that mobile devices actually, like, you cannot just have like phone, tablet, and desktop, right? And it doesn't work that way. It's full range from nothing to huge, right? So there is no simple answer. I'm not saying these definitions can sound simple, but they're actually quite complicated to define sometimes, right? And some of it requires automatic detection, right? When page loads, you know you're below the fold. When your JavaScript executes on the page, you know the pixel resolution of the screen. And you can make dynamic decisions based on that. I actually know that some people like Pinterest, I believe, themselves they wrote a pretty complicated algorithm to scroll, and based on the size of the screen, how many images can fit, and kind of lazy load fast enough, right? By the time you scroll, you still have content, right? So that's a very good example of that. There were a few other businesses that I cannot name that did kind of the same, especially when it's related to ads and things like that. So that's a very valid question. I believe the point of this talk is that you need to ask that question when you talk to designers during this design stage. And not only designers, but product people, because they are the ones who order the job, right? Design jobs, so they need to be in the room to do that, right? So ask them, hey, what happens below the fold, and what do you mean by below the fold? Because they usually use those terms, by the way, especially in the media business. If they come from newspaper world, yeah, I work with those guys. So those are the first 5 most important stages of the page load, right? And then there is a last step, or first step, depending on how you look at it, it's action. Basically, the whole human-computer interaction on the web is you load the content, you look at the content, you act on it, click, whatever you do, type your query, enter, next page loads. Then you act there, and next page loads, and all the way up until you and your user and business are satisfied, and you can leave to another website. Or dissatisfied, and they leave to another website anyway, but you go poor as a site owner, right? So there is another kind of this piece that stands between those two views, and it's important to acknowledge user action. How many of you typed in something or clicked the button and you were not sure if it actually accepted the input? Yes, yeah. So I actually have a couple examples, but yeah, that's a good example of why not. The funniest one is the most boring one. You probably saw some HR forms, online forms, or insurance, like, oh, don't press it again, we are loading your data. And they did it primarily so you don't submit data twice, because backend didn't like 2 submissions and they didn't have any algorithms on the backend. But the intent was kind of important, right? And people, I mean, eventually progressed to like disabling the button so you can actually not press, and then better messaging there, like loading, or we are about to load your data, or sometimes hateful, worst thing in the world called spinner, right? We can talk about that. Please, no spinners. In fact, one of our slides, maybe a year ago, was like a collection of spinners. You look at that, and you had almost the same feeling as the slide today, right? It's like, it was terrible, like constant slowness. Yeah, maybe worse. Yeah, I mean, in my spine for sure. I don't like the scary stuff though. So. Yeah, exactly. So the point is, acknowledge user action. You can actually win some of the experience, some of the benefit out of it if you do that. The great news is that this actually happens before the server is requested, before page is constructed. So even for today's like page-to-page navigation case, you can actually show progress before even request is made to the server, right? So a lot of technical challenge can be overcome on this step, right? The problem is that on the first view, you don't control that. That's your competitor. And you cannot play these tricks here, right? But there are a few tricks. I forgot to switch the slide, I'm sorry. In progress labels, updating the content area, that was an interesting one. I actually saw some people just erase everything below the nav, and it's awesome. Because, oh, the page is about to load, even though it actually didn't even request yet, right? But you kind of feel like, oh, the navigation of the next page is already loaded, and let me wait a little bit, right? So it's kind of, it might be that first step of acknowledging destination, right? Verifying destination that happened there, right? There was one crazy one from Etsy. At the moment, they were using PayPal for offering sales on their site, right? And at the moment, PayPal was slow. It's actually quite fast today, or faster, I should say. But at the moment, it was terribly slow. If you're in that business, you probably know what I'm talking about. So what Etsy did is they showed a huge overlay with the PayPal branding on it saying, we are opening PayPal the moment you click the button. So users are not frustrated with Etsy. they're frustrated with PayPal, but not with Etsy. Right? So you can kind of like, okay, yeah, I know PayPal sucks, but that's the way I pay online, right? And at least it's not Etsy. And there were a few other researchers actually that kind of Facebook, I believe, did some research looking at like that spinner on the mobile app. The splash screen. If it resembled Facebook regular progress indicator, people blame Facebook. But if it resembled iOS indicator, they blamed Apple. So even if you cannot win that game, at least point the finger somewhere. Not literally. You cannot explain, oh, Apple sucks, so sorry, we are loading. But kind of subtle, Or so it's not common use case, but sometimes you do need to do that, right? And the worst part is that you don't have any control over third party, right? When you navigate to third parties. So as much as you want to do, you cannot really improve that except for maybe trying to win a balanced game of like, hey, we bring you millions of dollars of revenue, please fix your shit. Yeah. So your question is if erasing content like below default, right, like current views content is risky. Yes, it's a complicated question. Technically, if next page doesn't show up, it's broken too. And if user clicked and didn't get to the next page twice, I think they know which page to go to. It's called Google, and that one is usually fast because it's actually in the browser already, right? Very fast to load. There are a few techniques there. If you're concerned that, oh, it just disappeared and now I need to wait for the next page, there are some skeletal design techniques that can be used to either animate away or fade out, things like that, that kind of also take a little longer time, giving that next page a little fora or whatever we call it. I don't know, it's a technical, like football term from Russia, soccer term, whatever. Anyway, so it's a complicated question. I think the point here is that designers should be answering that. It shouldn't be technical guys who build it, right? We have very particular perspective about it, right? We are probably the oldest internet users in our company, including our CEOs and designers on the team, right? We have, we know how to use website with the tabs even though we can see, right? We know where to hit the enter, or if that spinner in the top right corner on the mouse moves slowly, that means something is loading. Users don't know, and designers don't know. So ask them to design that. Work with them. I mean, you probably have a good input in that, right? Because you did experience it over and over again, and you have those nightmares from the first slide, But work with them. It's their job. They will be happy to jump on it. If you showcase it very clearly, designers and product people will know that. So for that, what you want to do is instead of one huge mock-up that you get that represents the final look of the page, go and create a phase one mockup, core branding mockup, primary content mockup, call to action mockup, secondary content, the rest of the content, right? And it's as easy as just whiting out the rest of it at each of the phases. And at the beginning, you as a technical team can do that, but generally designers should be able to do that. I mean, Photoshop is actually very easy to use in that sense. Not drawing something is actually quite simple. Identifying those zones, maybe not as easy. You might want to work with a product team, but designers usually work with a product team already. And what you can get out of it is instead of a Photoshop mockup, you can create what I call a progressive storyboard, right? The term borrowed from that animation work that that Tim was talking about, right? Where you design a film strip from your web page test. If you don't, how many of you used web page test? Please raise your hand. Awesome, almost everybody. Way to go. So, but basically, before we actually code it and can measure it, why don't we design it that way, right? And here you can see like this is the first visit, right? So you actually don't control anything before the action. But in reality, it started with the action, then all of those phases happen. And if you define it on the design stage, developers will actually have no problem building it, right? They will know what the priorities are. And as we discussed, maybe that action can also be designed as well. erasing stuff, or reusing content from the previous page. How many of you have a search page that then leads to the detail page, right? Title and main image are already loaded. Why not to display them before the rest of the content comes in, right? Obviously, it depends heavily on your product, right? It might actually require two teams that responsible for two pages actually work together. Hopefully, you have teams that work across, but still, you know. But put technical implementation aside. Make this a requirement, right? Because this requirement gets you 11 millions for 300 milliseconds improvement, right? It's not cheap to do it wrong. It's very expensive to do it wrong, and you're probably losing this money today, right? And make that a process. Make this storyboard for this animation. Like when you click, acknowledge action, that's the fade out effect, by the way, right? Like fade out primary content, so it's clear that they clicked, right? The rest of the content fades out, then it probably animates and at the same time verifies the destination, loads that header, and then you load primary content that during those 500 milliseconds that this took, actually were able to load, right? So show that text of the article, right? It's kind of contrived as a simple example, right? But, well, a Photoshop file that your designers bring to you today are also very fake, right? They have nothing to do with reality usually. You all know, you all make that HTML and build that, right? So design this, right? If you design this, you will be able to clearly identify the priority of user load, priority that matches product idea, right? That your business puts behind your digital software, right? Again, this is a user experience flow. You need to go and one by one load those pieces, those stages. And sometimes some primary content will be easy to load fast. By all means, don't hide it, right? Load it as quickly as possible, but prioritize things that load slower, not to delay those things that need to load sooner than that. And what you can do is actually put a technical constraint on those stages. For example, many of you know some of these techniques, inlining CSS and base64 logo, putting it within first 14 kilobytes, so TCP/IP level delivery is fast, so there's no need to wait for the retransmission packet, right? Some of these are very technically complex stuff, right? But you can achieve a lot. So if you can load your branding and logo in first few TCP packets, awesome, right? It delivered without really fighting the latency. And we talk a lot about protocols at this meetup. I don't want to go too deep into that, right? But so for example, second one, don't use any JavaScript, right? Use some HTML.
That sounds like piracy.
Yes, it is. And I always love at Meet for Speeds to show the fastest website I saw. People usually don't notice that it loads, and that's because it doesn't have JavaScript on it. 0. Well, actually, he added the analytics beacon to it over the years. But couple images, primary content to like primary CSS to it's called what's called critical CSS usually, right? Enough CSS to render primary content. No JavaScript, because until people can interact with it, you don't need JavaScript. Who cares, right? Let them see it at least. And so on, so on, so on. Skeletal CSS, kind of adjusting in the rest of the content, treating fonts as not a primary citizen of your page, but kind of an enhancement and things like that. The problem usually lies is that upgrading some feature from number 4 constraint to number 3 constraint is 10 times more expensive, right? So think of it, if it costs you $100 in development and operations to load the rest of the content, like kind of like you do today, then to show secondary content, to upgrade the rest of the content to secondary content will cost you 1,000, and then 10,000, 100,000, a million. Obviously, you cannot fit the whole site in first 14 kilobytes. Well, actually, some people can. Like Google, for example, right? First homepage loads under 14 kilobytes, right? But it's very expensive to get at that decision, right? So think of it as like a step ladder of a price, right? And that's how you will be able to help business people prioritize those decisions. You kind of say, okay, yeah, surely we can move it. So your budget for this is not $1 million, it's 10 million now. Thank you very much. We'll go start developing. They're like, oh, wait. we need to make sure that's worth it, right? So this kind of can help you align the technical implementation framework with the business framework of designing this. And don't speak in those terms at business meetings. They hate us for this. They hate us for not understanding what TCP/IP is, or packets, or slow start, or whatever other mumbo jumbo that we say is, right? But if you can keep this conversation on the left in that direction, you can arrive at good results. I'm having some success at my organization with that. So keep this throughout the design and development process. Start with the wireframes for like maybe multiple wires of like how the progress state looks like, what do you show while your 1,500 images load, or whatever else, right? Things like that. Create a progressive storyboard like I showed you, right? Kind of in addition to very detailed, huge pixel resolution thing, show the progression, maybe have multiple layers hiding, and if you are very into it, or just print them and white them out, That's what I did, actually. I printed them and put them in front of the business, and they saw it very clear, right? And then I used PowerPoint, actually, to annotate things, which is probably the best tool of all things. I hate PowerPoint. And then when you develop HTML, create HTML mockups. And some of you probably already jump into, instead of having Photoshop mockups because of responsive world, you probably already start building in HTML very early on, right? Like HTML mockups or coded mockups, things like that. Well, think about it this way, right? Either develop separate ones so business can actually look, load it, even measure it, maybe, and see how that loads. What will it look like while things load? Because today, if you designed that progress indication screen or maybe a skeletal design, unless UI records the video, you will not be able to notice it on a local network, right? So there is no way to really look at it and see, hey, this is how it will look. And business will have a hard time deciding whether it is good or not. So actually, have the file that shows the progress, and no matter what happens, it will not progress because it's a static HTML in that stage, right? And I'm exercising the idea, maybe have a query string parameter in your final implementation that just finishes at that stage, right? Like HTML doesn't have anything else, just a branding. Let's look how fast it loads, right? And maybe second step, don't load any JavaScript. Let's see how fast that loads. Great news about it is that you will be able to use those kind of URLs in a web page test, right? And actually test synthetically or even RAM. Well, RAM is kind of hard because users cannot interact with it, but synthetically you will be able to test and actually see the difference between loading only primary content and loading the rest of it and call to action as well, right? So maybe build some of it into your development framework. I don't have answer today what to do for that, but kind of query string if statement kind of comes to mind. Don't have a block of JavaScript commented out when the parameter is there, something like that. And in pre-prod, test that. I'm positive that nothing is free. Bringing search results faster costs a lot. So those of you who work on some Elasticsearch versus this and that know that every millisecond is very expensive there, especially if you have a lot of features. So why not to show that, we actually entertain the user while the rest of the content loads or whatever. We load first few results very fast and the rest of the results a little slower while they're looking at the first ones, something like that, right? Have the way to easily showcase that for your business users to potentially look at it and not have any doubt. You send them a link, they open it, they're like, oh, shit, this is enough. Why do we even load the rest of it or something like that? I don't know. That might be a little aggressive, right? So establish this process of defining speed very early on and carrying it on through development, right? It's the only way we can actually fight this game, because today it's left for the optimization. It's left for, oh, you guys messed up. You technical guys messed up. It's slow now, right? Don't do that to yourself, first of all. Bring it to the process, right? Because frankly, having so many images in a freaking Photoshop markup is designer's fault, not yours, or product person's fault. Stop pretending this is a hidden secret in the room, right? Speak it out. So define that process, define those deliverables that come to you, to developers from design teams. Set those constraints and establish a very clear budgetary demarcation. We are okay to put it, make it much faster. Give us 10 times more money for this piece of the budget. Easy, right? You know, maybe not 10 times, maybe you say 3 times, or maybe order of magnitude, which is in their terms is usually 2 to 3. You know? So measure the difference. Measure the difference between first phase, second phase, third phase, fourth phase, things like that. And I know I call them by numbers because they are so ingrained in my brain already. I've been doing it for a while, you know. But kind of have that clear depiction of what is what for yourself and measure it, and make sure that none of those degrade. Or if there is a degradation that you cannot fight, at least it's on the latest phases of the page load, right? Ideally on those invisible ones, right? That user actually will wait for, no problem. Well, not for 130 megabytes though, but still, they will wait. And avoid those anti-patterns like those carousels that load JavaScript and images and only then start to render, right? Instead of rendering the first picture. And hopefully this will help you speed up your website and enroll your business partners into this quest for faster user experience. Thank you. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have. Good point. Good point. So to summarize it, how do you measure this? Because today we cannot measure that. Today we measure on load event, right? Or whatever we use today, or maybe hopefully you're not measuring time to first byte still. You know, in fact, I gave a talk this summer, kind of related to this, on about the metrics, right? Exactly about that example. And it is a challenge because until we measure it, we don't know if we are good or not, if we degrade or not, right? And half of the answer is actually using real user measurement, which will get you much farther in the game today. Unfortunately, they also measure one metric of performance, right? And when someone on the business side says, oh, how fast are we? Without the RAM, you usually say 3 seconds, 4 seconds. They're like, oh, do we need 2 seconds or what? You know, with RAM, at least you show them the distribution, right? And you say, if you move some of these users to the left, you will make that much more money. By the way, I'm not a salesperson for Sosta. They actually have this what-if chart that you can say, let's move 100 milliseconds to the left, how many more millions we'll have, because they measure revenue as well. And they actually can correlate one to another, right? And they literally know that those users on the right will convert more if they move to the left, right? That's the first answer. The second part of the answer is actually more complicated because RAM actually cannot bring us enough information. One benefit of RAM is it's on every user's page, on every user's computer, but the downside is that it can only measure that much because you cannot record a video, for example, and transfer it back to your server. It will be impractical, right? It will heavily degrade user experience for sure. You know, for that reason, you can use this technique that I talked about called heat maps and kind of creating zones that correspond to these phases and measure them independently in synthetic way, right? And that's the kind of, when I mentioned that Antoine and I are going to implement that as part of web page test, that's what we were talking about. Kind of instead of speed index that calculates like everything above the fold, speaking of above the fold, right? You mark those zones and say, hey, how fast does this piece of the page solidify and finalize its view, right? Because we might not care if the background loaded in that CNN example, but if that picture of those two people, or was it the same person, I don't know, rendered, that's kind of a primary content. It's very clear, or a logo or background on that nav, right? So that's the second part of the answer. And today, there is no answer. Today's tools don't support that. I actually worked for the INET race last year. So nobody is there yet. RAM is as closest as you can get, but again, they're answering the technical answer. How fast is your page? And that fast is measured by technical thingy, whatever event in the browser, whatever that is. It has nothing to do with the business or user experience thing. And that's what heat maps technique is about. Yeah, I actually recorded that. Yes. It's called using heat maps to improve performance metrics. Yes, user timing API. The question is whether we can use a user timing API. User timing API is the way to encode that using RAM tools today. And yes, that's kind of the best we have today. Unfortunately, well, you can do that, yes. But it's kind of prone to the problem of how does JavaScript know what user experienced, right? Knowing the picture of what they saw is much closer to what user experienced. Still not that, right? They might hate your site. Maybe the yellow sucks, you know? I don't know. But it's closer to what user experiences versus JavaScript just, hey, I know my data came in. It means right about now it's supposed to render, right? In fact, we cannot even instrument actual paint. We cannot know when paint happened of every pixel within JavaScript because it will overload your engine. Browsers will be slowing down like hell. So there is a good reason for it. You know, in synthetic world you can, right? You just capture the screenshots every 100 milliseconds. You get your instrumentation, right? But in a run way, not as great. But yes, user timing is your best choice today. So what's the overhead of using this method for developers? Well, I would say overhead for designers is higher because they actually will talk to business a lot to figure out what's more important, and they will fight, right? So just saying, they often paid more, but just saying, at least the business part. You know? There is an overhead, absolutely. But if you ask a developer today, they'd rather do that than guess all of this themselves. Because today, that's what's happening, right? Today, well, at best, they're guessing. At worst, they don't give a damn, right? And then the price is too high. So I don't think an overhead is significant. Maybe if you encode it in everywhere in your stack, it is higher than if you just look at the mockups and don't guess what is primary, what is secondary, right? So that's probably your cheapest way. Just don't have overhead on developer and have an overhead on the business side, right? But you can, foreseeably, you can implement that in your process, and the benefit of measurability of different phases and things like that would be pretty high. And user timing, that's where you embed that. Hopefully you're planning for that already, or maybe doing that. Videos are, well, the question is kind of video experience. How do we optimize it? Are there easy wins? First of all, you need to measure. I know it sounds weird, but you don't know, right? Until you see how that experience happens, not with your eyes, but with a tool that shows you what your dependencies are, you don't know. Second of all, in terms of that budget for web traffic that people spend on their phone to download those videos just to display their first slides might be a thing that you want to reconsider. Yes, I know I didn't answer your question. You know. If you notice, some of the social networks kind of convert GIFs to videos or have a first few frames of the video pre-downloaded because that's part of the user experience. So it depends on what kind of user experience you want to create. That being said, the video until you hit play is just an image, right? The only problem is that I don't know what you use for hosting, but oftentimes if you use a third-party provider for hosting and use their players, you kind of you're not only inheriting the video stream complexity, but also the rendering of the player and things like that. I don't know, maybe you don't because you use MP4s directly, right? Yeah, okay. So in your case, it doesn't matter. I mean, for smaller setups, it's not a problem. When you need analytics, it's more, and other pieces that it's more complicated, you know. In any case, look at it from progressive perspective. If you cannot speed up video download, well, black square with a play button in it is better than background with play button on it. Or no play button whatsoever, or whatever. You know, kind of look at it, what would you show until the video arrives, right? So that's the only technique that you can use, right? Yeah, sometimes some of those problems are speed of light problems. We cannot improve it. You know, we cannot make China closer to America, so data loaded from China is faster, loads faster. Well, China is a whole other story, but London, right? Well, sometimes you pay for CDN for that, right? So that's why you use static hosting on GitHub, because it's backed by Fastly, for example, right? For your personal site, I mean, because that's on the edge, that's on the closest computer to the user, right? And some of these problems are not necessarily technically complex, but financially complex. in order to buy your own video platform and be able to choose one, you need a lot of money, you know, or you have a very limited functionality that you can deliver, right? You know, so there is no simple answer. I cannot answer that. So that's why I kind of define these stages in a very abstract way, so you can apply that to your business, right? These are kind of concentrated on the user experience. Users experience things almost the same way, right? Oh yeah, these slides will be published to the meetup, and for every meetup, in the comments you will find the link to the video and the slides if we have some, at least for a while. If you don't find any, let me know. Maybe I'll dig them up. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Speed them up.